Hi everybody, welcome back to Swordwind. We are the Charlotte branch of the New York Historical Fencing Association. My name is Eric Lowe, and today we are going to continue our video series on fundamental longsword cutting mechanics. Last video we talked about what the hands do. This video we are talking about what the arms do. Now the headline for this video is that arms are there for steering and they're there for power transmission. They are not there for power generation. Power generation comes first from the hands. Remember this grip squeeze we talked about last video, and it comes from this twist of the hips. It does not come from the muscles of the arms, aside from what you need to be able to squeeze your fingers. So if you are muscling through your cuts, really kind of pulling or shoving with your massive guns here, you're going to need to kind of train yourself not to do that. Let the sword do what it's doing without your tense arm muscles trying to help. Before we go much further, we need to talk about how it is that longswords cut. As all of you know, longswords are straight-bladed. That means there is no significant curve to either edge. And as a result of that, these are really bad at slicing. And that's not to say that they can't give draw cuts or push cuts. In fact, for those of you who study the KDF tradition of Lichtenauer, as I do, draw and push cuts are one of the three kind of Lichtenauer approved ways you can wound somebody with a blade. But compared to the hewing power of a straight blade, its slicing power is much less. What we are looking for with a straight blade is to impact the target, open a crack using the fact that the edge is a wedge, and we are hitting forcefully enough to open a crack in the target medium. And then we want the blade to just run straight through the target because it has enough momentum to propagate that crack through and out of the target. Now, as you know, momentum is a function of mass and velocity. The mass of your sword is fixed wherever it is on the blade that you happen to hit. So what we need to do is figure out how to increase its velocity. Now, my arms can make this motion, this downward descending motion, in pretty much the same amount of time, no matter if I am doing this or this or this. So what we are going to go for instead is think back to your high school physics classes and questions about which point on a wheel is moving fastest. Arms, because they are connected to a shoulder, only really move in circles. So what I am aiming to do is make the biggest circle possible with my arms and my sword. Since my RPMs are basically fixed, the amount of time it takes me to finish the swing is negligible. There's a negligible difference there no matter what kind of swing I make. I want to make a bigger radius of the circle. For fixed RPMs, the greater the radius of the circle, the faster a point on the end of that circle is moving. This is what Ringnick and Pseudo von Danzig are talking about when they tell us to hew long with extended arms. Doing so not only has the tactical benefit of hitting your opponent from further away, but it also has the mechanical benefit of actually increasing the power of your hew. So how is that accomplished? I said we don't want to be muscling down or out with our arms. So what is it that makes the arms move? A phrase you will often hear is that you want your arms to be loose like ropes. Now that doesn't mean, obviously, there is literally no muscle tone in your arms. If that was true, then the only guard we could hold would be this. And that is obviously not how we fight. However, it does mean that as much as possible, you want to keep your arms loose. If you are tensing up with your biceps, if you're tensing up down here, you need to slow down and just kind of let the sword fall. Letting the sword fall is in fact essentially what moves the arms forward. Remember, we start our cuts with this finger squeeze, and that kicks the tip of the sword forward. What moves my arms forward is the fact that I have a weight in my hands that is moving forward, and I am throwing my hips forward at the same time, so that that weight and that hip throw casts my arms forward naturally. Now the job of my arms is simply to steer the sword so that it falls in the way that I want it to. I am tight up here with my hands. I am loose down here with my arms. Lots of action going on in the hips. We'll talk about that next video. Tight, loose, tight. Now, how exactly am I trying to steer? I want to think about casting the tip of my sword forward towards my opponent. This is a descending cut. This is an ascending cut. This is a horizontal cut. But the opponent is over there, and that's the direction I want to think about, not off to the side or down or up. So you can, some people find it helpful to think of punching their top hand forward like this. If that's helpful for you, then that's fine. What I personally find most helpful is not to think about where my arms are going at all, but to think about the tip of my sword. The glosses use this example, the Nuremberg House book, I believe it is, when he says, think about a string being tied to the tip of your sword, connected to the part of your opponent you want to hit, usually the head, and the tip, and that string just pulls the tip of your sword straight towards the target area. This is particularly in contrast to three things. We'll talk about this more a little bit later, but for now I am not talking about casting dramatically up and out with the sword. This doesn't really increase the range of my, the radius of my circle at all, but it is needlessly telegraphic and slow. I'm also not talking about just unfolding from the elbows. I'm not talking about doing this. That shortens my cut, and in doing so, it not only shortens my range and makes me vulnerable to all sorts of techniques such as the Schielhound or Wechseln, but it also, because it shortens the radius of my hew, makes my cuts less forceful. Finally, I don't want to cast my hands forward by punching forward with the pommel and then flipping the sword around. The problem with this is that although my arms are extended when I hit my target, it places the center of the circle here at my elbow rather than here at my shoulder. So although my arms are extended, I am losing all of this radius, which is a big deal. So we want a nice straight cast. We want a nice straight cast forward. We want arms fully extended at the point of contact. And now, what does the end point look like? You'll see here I have been ending my cuts in line with my belly button. If you want a somewhat crude but easy to remember mnemonic, you should be able to punch yourself in the junk with your pommel. Please do not actually punch yourself in the junk with your pommel, nor hump it with a pelvic thrust, but you should be able to. The reason for this is that I want to keep my arms fully extended all the way through the cut. There's two reasons for that. One, I don't know, and both of them are connected to maintaining power generation all the way through the cut. Even if my opponent's head is right here, I don't know if I'm going to bind on a sword unexpectedly up here, and I want to be able to get all the way through his body so that my sword actually exits his silhouette and is free to defend myself at the end of the cut. If I cut to here, then I am aiming to end my cut somewhere in my opponent's torso. I am aiming to get my sword stuck, essentially. And even if that does put my opponent out of action immediately, there are all sorts of situations in which it would be dangerous for me to have disabled my sword. For instance, my opponent might have friends. And on top of that, it's I don't want to count on any given sword blow instantly disabling my opponent. Most of the time it will. The times it doesn't are the ones that count. So a nice full Oberhau ends down towards the ground. You'll notice my point is here in front of my left foot, just like Sudo von Danzig and Ringek instruct us that it should be, and my arms are bent. Now I can achieve this as well by cutting over to my hip, but that forces me to bend an arm. The problem with bent arms is that it means that my two arms are not acting in concert on the sword. They're not doing the same thing. Now you can train around getting an arm, you can train around the differences between what this arm is doing and what this arm is doing, but it's needlessly complicated, and it actually shortens your hue. Right? Here, you can see I can just touch my chair with a bent back hand. If I extend out, I get a good 2 inches or so of extra range. That's if any of you have fought against swords that are even just 2 inches different in range, you in length rather, you will appreciate how much that difference can actually mean in a fight. So when I cast, the point I am aiming for is right here in line with my center. I want the point between my two hands to be in line with my center line, and I want my tip to be in line with my center line. I want to emphasize this point between the two hands being in line with the center. That is true for all cuts, whether you are doing an Oberhau, an Unterhau, here, a Zwerhau, here, Krumpau, here, or any other kind of cut. This point needs to be in line with your belly button. So, to go over what good arms look like, nice and loose, cast forward, ending in line with your belly button. Remember that pelvic thrust to the pommel, like so. Now let's talk about a number of ways that that can go wrong. The first and most obvious, the first one, if we kind of just rewind what we just talked about, is if the tip is not in line with the line between the point between your hands and the belly button. You see a lot of students, especially new ones, start with their blade pointed off to the right in Vomtog, and when they cut down, their hands might be in the right place, but their point is still pointed out to the right. This is essentially cutting crooked. Now you can do that. That's what a Krumpau is. Cutting basically from Vomtog, and the point ends up pointed a different direction than where your hands went. But it requires a different and more complex set of body mechanics that we will get to at some point in a future video. For a basic Oberhau, remember the plane of the cut is this plane here, and that means the sword should end up pointing to the left. If I'm cutting from right to left with a basic cut, my point needs to end up pointed to the left. If I'm cutting from left to right with a basic cut, my point needs to end up pointing to the right. So when you are making these cuts, check not just this point and this point, but also where is your tip? This is wrong, this is right. When I say wrong and right, by the way, I mean that this kind of motion without a Krumpau's corresponding body mechanics will bite into the target, if you're lucky, and get stuck. And anytime you are cutting with a sword, you want that sword to exit the opponent's body so that it is immediately available for your defense. That's one of the tactical advantages of cuts over thrusts. And if any of you have done any reading on historical sword fights, you will see, you'll be familiar with lots of examples where people ran their opponent through and then suffered a wound, sometimes a mortal wound, in response while their sword was still stuck in the target before they had been able to disengage it. The second thing that often goes wrong is that your hands overpronate. And we talked about this last video, but if your sword, if your wrist breaks beyond about this point, then you are creating a failure point for your cut. Remember, the point of this grip is to put the skeletal structure behind the edge. And the reason we want to do that is because even with a very sharp sword, there will be a reaction force when you hit the target. That reaction force needs to be absorbed by a nicely structured arm, you don't want to lose a whole bunch of momentum because you have essentially a limp wrist. After that, I want to talk about your eyes. If I do a practice cut correctly, I am looking at my target the whole time, even though my sword is no longer pointed at the target. Then I check my endpoint. Oftentimes when you teach this to beginners, they will do this instead. They follow the point of the sword all the way through the cut. And what that does is it naturally pulls the upper body down towards the endpoint. The problem with that, aside from the fact that it offers the head as a target, is that it turns what should be a straight shearing hew in, through, and out of the target into a little bit of a push cut. Not very much, but enough that it will seriously affect the power of your hew. In a similar manner, oftentimes you'll see beginners or just fences who are really amped up on adrenaline lean forward with their cuts. That has all the same problems of offering the head. It will pull the heel of your foot off the ground, which is bad for reasons we'll talk about next video. And it takes part of the vector that should be straight down and turns it into forward. One of the psychological reasons this happens sometimes, especially with beginners, is that their mind knows they are throwing a weight forward and they feel the need to compensate for that by moving their center of gravity forward. If that is your problem, pick up your sword again. Remember, this weighs substantially less than 4 pounds. You could do exercises with this thing with a 4-pound barbell all day, and you could hold it out here all day. It is not nearly massive enough to overbalance you. If you're having kind of these psychological problems, either of leaning back to counterbalance yourself from the fact that a weight is going forward, or letting that weight pull your center of gravity forward, just spend some time meditating on how light this actually is. We've talked about eyes, kind of upper body. One more failure point for the upper body is non-level shoulders. The problem with this is that it essentially bends the arm. By jerking one shoulder above the other, it means that the path that this arm takes is substantially different from the path that this arm takes. And we have the same problem of the arms pulling on the sword in uneven ways. Remember that we want to propagate that crack through the target through momentum alone. The analogy you want to think about here is taking a pair of scissors, cutting into some wrapping paper, and just running those scissors down along the wrapping paper. Or if you're into sewing, you can do the same thing with fabric, as you know. But if you stop moving your scissors, or if you tweak them a little bit, then the blade stops propagating the cut and gets stuck because it doesn't have enough force to create a new cut, basically from scratch. For better or worse, European swords of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance tend to be giant pieces of giant springs. This is great for your sword's durability. It is bad for tracking in a cut. You don't want this going on as you're traveling this way. You don't want the sword constantly banging up into the target medium. And pulling unevenly on the sword will tend to do that just a little bit. But it only has to be a little bit for you to lose a whole bunch of momentum through friction between the flat and the target medium. Again, swords stuck in the target are bad. Finally, I want to go back to what I said before about the arms. Again, casting up and out doesn't actually increase the radius of our circle. Here is still the point of extension at the moment of contact, whether I do this or whether I do this. So there's nothing I gain by going up. There's a lot that I lose if I don't move my elbows forward. You'll note, if I turn side on, you'll notice that my elbows do move forward a little bit. I'm not deliberately throwing them forward. This is just the natural result of that finger squeeze and hip throw that I talked about. If I consciously undo that, if I keep my elbows tight and just unfold from the elbow, then I'm shortening my hue, shortening my radius, tactically bad, bad for mechanics. Finally, again, punching the hands forward and then unfolding shortens my radius by moving the point of rotation out of my core and into my elbow. One way you can check this, since it can be difficult to tell the difference between this and this, is to have a training partner put a belt around your sword when you're up in guard and do your normal cue. If you are punching forward with the blade and then unfolding, you will slip out of the loop and be able to finish the cut. If you are doing it right, then you will get stuck right here because there's none of that slide out and down motion. So put a belt around the top of your sword, have a partner hold it, and see if you get stuck when you do this. I hope that's been helpful for those of you who are following along. Thank you very much. Next week we will talk about what is going on below the waist and the hips, the knees, and the feet. And the video after that we'll talk about kind of putting all of this together in the proper order of operations and some more things that can go wrong when you're trying to coordinate hands, arms, and lower body all at the same time. Once again, my name is Eric Lowe. This is Swordwind, the Charlotte branch of the New York Historical Fencing Association. Thank you very much.